I told the boy he was a fool, and I said it loud enough for every officer in the reception hall to hear me. He was young, barely out of the academy, a junior lieutenant named Sorath who had been assigned to my unit less than a month ago. He stood near the beverage table with 3 officers from other species, his amber eyes wide, his jaw slack, repeating a story he had clearly heard secondhand. A story about a human. They say he held the pass for 11 hours. Sorath was telling the Palani navigator beside him. Alone. Against 200 armed insurgents. He did not retreat. He did not call for support. When they found him, he was still standing, still firing. They had to order him to stop. I set my glass down on the nearest surface, hard enough to make the Palani flinch. That is physically impossible, I said. I walked toward their little circle and watched their faces shift as they recognized my rank. Commander Vela Sorath, 31 years of service to the Thelvari Dominion, 12 combat deployments, 9 confirmed enemy command kills. I had earned the right to be heard when I spoke, and I intended to use it. 200 against 1 for 11 hours. Do the arithmetic, Lieutenant. If each attacker engages for even 3 minutes, your human would need to sustain continuous combat for 10 hours, without rest, hydration, or ammunition resupply. His weapon systems would overheat. His body would fail from dehydration alone. The story is a lie. Sorath's crest flattened against his skull. Commander, there are multiple confirmed accounts from independent observers. Confirmed by whom? Other humans? I let the contempt sit openly on my face. I wanted the room to see it. I wanted every officer from every species present to understand that at least one member of the Coalition command staff was not susceptible to fairy tales. Their species has a documented cultural tendency toward mythologizing combat performance. They turn every skirmish into an epic and every soldier into a god. I have studied their historical records in considerable detail. A small rearguard action at a bridge becomes the foundation of an entire civilization's identity. A failed cavalry charge becomes sacred poetry that children recite in schools. A catastrophic naval defeat gets reframed as a moral victory because the losing soldiers refuse to surrender. They are not warriors. They are storytellers who happen to carry weapons, and the galaxy has been gullible enough to take their fiction as fact. The Palani navigator looked uncomfortable and found something interesting to study on the wall behind me. A Dreth medical officer standing nearby examined the floor with sudden fascination. Even Sorath, young and earnest and full of the awe that academy cadets develop when they first hear the human stories, had the sense to close his mouth. I have fought real wars, I continued, because I could see the doubt lingering in Sorath's expression, and I wanted it burned away completely. I have killed enemies with these hands. I have torn through armored carapace with my claws, and felt the life drain out of things twice my size. I have held positions under fire for hours, genuinely held them, with my own blood on the floor, and my soldiers dying around me. And I can tell you from direct, personal, painful experience that sustained solo combat against 200 opponents is a fantasy. It is a campfire story told by a species that needs to believe it is more than what the biology clearly shows it to be. I lifted my hand, extended my claws, and let the ambient light catch the scarred keratin surfaces. Humans have nothing that compares to this. Their skin tears like wet paper. Their bones break under impacts that would bruise a Thelvari child. They have no venom, no natural armor, no sensory advantages worth discussing. Their healing is pathetically slow. The only thing exceptional about them is their ability to generate propaganda, and I find it personally insulting that professional military officers are standing around repeating it as though it were intelligence data. Nobody argued with me. Nobody ever did. That was the advantage of being right, and of being willing to say what everyone else was thinking but too diplomatic to voice. The reception was a standard diplomatic affair aboard the Coalition station orbiting Athkara 6. I had been assigned to the surface outpost as the senior Thelvari military liaison, and the evening was meant to introduce the Joint Command Staff before deployment. There were officers from 6 species present, all of them part of the Coalition garrison, tasked with holding the planet against potential Veshkari swarm incursion from the contested border. It was supposed to be a quiet posting, strategic but stable, the kind of assignment they gave to senior officers who needed a rotation out of active combat zones, but who were too valuable to waste on administrative roles. I had expected competence, discipline, professional rigor. I had not expected to spend my first evening listening to legends. I met the human the following morning. His name was Sergeant Cade Harlow, and he was the single most unremarkable soldier I had ever encountered in 3 decades of military service. He arrived at the outpost shuttle bay carrying a standard duffel and a single equipment case. He was of medium height for his species, lean but not muscular in any impressive sense, with short brown hair that was starting to show traces of gray at the temples, and a face that held no expression I could read as dangerous or commanding or anything other than mildly pleasant. He wore a plain field uniform without decoration, no campaign badges, no unit insignia beyond basic rank identification, no visible scars, no augmentation marks, nothing that said this man had ever been within 100 kilometers of a fight. He shook hands with the officers who greeted him. He answered their questions with short, polite sentences that never exceeded what was required. He found his assigned quarters, stowed his gear, and appeared in the mess hall 30 minutes later, where he ate bland rations without complaint, and read something on a data pad, with the distracted focus of a man reviewing supply requisitions. I watched him from across the room and felt vindicated. This was the species that the galaxy whispered about. This quiet, ordinary creature who chewed his food slowly and kept his eyes on his reading material, like a clerk reviewing inventory reports. If the legends were true, if humans were truly the most dangerous combatants in known space, then surely they would send their best to a contested border world, where the Veshkari swarm was a genuine strategic concern. And their best was this: a middle-aged sergeant with no decorations and no presence, who looked like he belonged behind a logistics desk. I turned to Sorath, who was eating beside me. "There is your legendary warrior," I said. "Try not to worship him too openly. You might embarrass the Dominion." Sorath said nothing, but I caught him watching Harlow across the mess hall with an expression I did not care for. It was something between curiosity and the particular tension that prey animals display when they sense a predator nearby, but cannot identify its location. A wariness that lived below conscious thought. I dismissed it as the lingering effect of those ridiculous stories. Sorath was young. He would learn. Over the next several days, I observed Harlow as part of my standard assessment of all personnel under joint command. He performed his duties with quiet competence that bordered on invisible. He reviewed defensive protocols and suggested minor adjustments that were reasonable, but uninspired. He inspected communication equipment, ran diagnostic checks on the outpost sensor grid, filed maintenance reports that were thorough and precisely formatted, and completely devoid of personality. He spoke when spoken to, and offered opinions only when directly asked for them. He deferred to ranking officers without hesitation or apparent resentment. He was, by every measurable professional standard, a perfectly adequate mid-level non-commissioned officer with no distinguishing characteristics whatsoever. It bothered me enormously that other species treated him as though he were something more. The Polani engineering team asked Harlow, not me, where to reinforce the perimeter wall during a routine maintenance cycle. I was standing right there. The ranking military officer in the room, with 3 decades of defensive fortification experience, and the chief engineer walked past me to consult a human sergeant. A Dreth medical officer deferred to Harlow's judgment on evacuation routing, despite the fact that evacuation planning fell squarely and explicitly within my operational authority. Even the station's Kathiri logistics coordinator, a species known for rigid, almost religious adherence to chain of command, addressed Harlow with a degree of deference that bordered on reverence. I raised the issue during a command meeting. I was professional about it. I did not name individuals. I simply noted that advisory personnel should route their recommendations through the established chain of command, rather than operating as independent authorities, and that the coalition's effectiveness depended on clear jurisdictional boundaries being respected by all parties. Harlow, sitting at the far end of the table, nodded and agreed without argument. The matter should have ended there. But it did not, because 14 days into my deployment, Harlow came to me with something that would eventually save every life in the outpost, and I told him he was wrong. He requested a private meeting in the tactical planning room and presented sensor data from the eastern ridge. Long-range geological scans showed subsurface movement patterns, biological signatures at depths that should have been solid basalt rock. The readings were faint and intermittent, easily mistaken for tectonic noise or equipment drift or mineral deposit thermal fluctuation. But Harlow had been tracking them for 9 days, plotting each reading on a spatial model with timestamps and frequency analysis. And when he laid out the complete pattern on the display table, even I could see the convergence. The movement was trending toward the outpost along 3 distinct axes. "They are mapping us," he said. His voice was calm, the same mild tone he used for everything, as though he were discussing weather patterns rather than potential annihilation. "These are probe runs. They send small groups to trigger our sensors and measure our response time. Then they pull back and adjust their approach vector. Each probe run gets closer to the perimeter and lasts 11 to 14% longer than the previous one. They are testing which approaches we cover fastest and which ones we neglect, and they are doing it with a systematic methodology that suggests coordinated intelligence." "The Veshkari are a hive species with limited tactical cognition," I replied. I had studied the swarm extensively during my preparation for this assignment. I had read every available intelligence assessment. They overwhelm through numbers and biological ferocity. They do not conduct intelligence operations. Their hive mind processes threat and response at a reflexive level, not a strategic one. "Commander, with respect, I have seen this exact pattern before," he said, "on Restari 3 and on the Kathiri border station at Voss Point. Both outposts showed the same subsurface probe activity for approximately 3 weeks before the assault came. Both were overrun within hours of the initial breach. The current pattern at this outpost is consistent with a timeline that puts us approximately 6 to 9 days from a major incursion. Both of those outposts were also defended by understrength garrison forces without Thelvari command leadership," I said. "We are not those outposts. Our perimeter defenses are rated for swarm-level engagement. Our garrison is at full strength with combat-experienced personnel from 4 species. I am not going to trigger a base-wide alert and request fleet support because a human sergeant is nervous about some anomalous sensor readings." He held my gaze for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that I could not identify. Something patient and measured and old. Something that did not match his unremarkable face or his mild manners. It lasted only a second, and then it was gone, replaced by the polite acceptance I had come to expect from him. "Understood, Commander. I would like permission to make some personal preparations, in case the readings develop further. Nothing that would affect outpost operations or alarm the garrison." I waved him off with a flick of my claws. "Do as you please, Sergeant. Just stay within your advisory scope, and do not spread unnecessary concern among the other personnel." He left without another word. That night, I lay in my quarters and told myself I was right. I reviewed the intelligence assessments again. The Veshkari swarm operated on biological imperatives, not strategic calculation. Their attacks were mass events, driven by reproductive pressure and territorial instinct, not planned campaigns. The idea that they were conducting calculated reconnaissance against a fortified coalition position was anthropomorphizing animal behavior, which was, I reflected, exactly the kind of thinking that humans were prone to. They saw intention where there was only instinct. They imposed narrative on nature. I was certain of this. Completely certain, with the full confidence of a decorated commander who had read the data and drawn the correct conclusion. That certainty would cost lives. Not Harlow's certainty, mine. 3 days later, Sorath came to me with a report that made my scales prickle along the ridge of my spine. He had been observing Harlow on my standing orders to monitor advisory personnel activity. What he reported was not insubordination. It was not a violation of any regulation I had established. It was simply the quiet, methodical behavior of a man preparing for something that he believed was inevitable. Harlow had reinforced his personal armor at the joint seams using composite materials from the outpost machine shop. He had placed small sealed containers at 3 separate points within the outpost interior, positions that seemed random until you overlaid them on a structural map and realized they covered the 3 most likely bypass routes to the civilian shelter. Each container held ammunition compatible with multiple weapon types, medical supplies sufficient for field treatment of serious wounds, and a small data card. He had recalibrated his primary weapon to a frequency that Soreth did not recognize, and when Soreth looked it up, he found it matched the resonant fracture point of Veshkari carapace armor. And he had been running solo combat exercises in the lower cargo bay every night between 0200 and 0400 hours, after the rest of the garrison had entered sleep cycle. I watched him train, Sorath said, and I noticed that his voice had changed. The youthful eagerness that usually colored everything he said was gone, replaced by something careful and thin. Commander, he moved in ways that did not correspond to his apparent physiology. He is too fast for his body mass. His transitions between combat stances are seamless, without the fractional pauses that indicate conscious decision-making. It was like watching a machine that someone had wrapped in skin and taught to breathe. "You are being dramatic," I said. "I am being accurate," Sorath replied, and the fact that he contradicted me directly, which he had never done before in his short career, told me he was genuinely unsettled by what he had seen. "Commander, I have trained with Thelvari Special Operations soldiers. I have watched the best fighters our species has produced. None of them moved the way he moves. It is not a question of skill. It is something else. Something I do not have a word for. I almost went to the cargo bay that night. Almost. I got as far as the corridor junction on sub-level 3 before I stopped myself, told myself that watching a human do push-ups in the dark was beneath my rank and dignity, and turned back. Instead, I pulled up Harlow's service file and read it for the second time. It was remarkably thin for a soldier with 12 years of deployment history, basic training scores that were above average but not exceptional, a deployment list with unit designations but no operational details, which meant the missions were classified at levels above my coalition clearance. A medical record that listed 17 major injuries over 12 years of active service, including 4 instances of what humans called field expedient self-treatment, which, as far as I could determine from context, meant he had performed medical procedures on himself during active combat because no medic was available, or because the tactical situation did not allow him to stop fighting long enough to be treated. 17 major injuries, 12 years, still serving, still deploying to contested zones, still running combat drills at 2 in the morning in a dark cargo bay. I closed the file and went to sleep, and in the last moments before unconsciousness took me, I heard Soreth's voice in my memory saying, "It is something else, something I do not have a word for," and I pushed it away and let the dark carry me under. 4 hours later, the ground beneath my quarters began to shake, and the world I thought I understood came apart at the seams. The proximity alarms hit first. A shrieking, oscillating wall of sound that tore through the outpost like a physical force, loud enough to vibrate the fluid in my inner ears and send a spike of pain through the base of my skull. Then came the vibration, deep and visceral and wrong. Not the steady rhythm of tectonic activity, but the churning, organic pulse of something enormous and alive, moving through solid earth directly beneath my feet. I was out of my sleeping platform and reaching for my weapon before the first structural alert sounded, and by the time my claws closed around the grip of my sidearm, I could already hear the screaming. Not alarm signals, not automated warnings, not the mechanical voices of the outpost's emergency systems. The screaming of soldiers, living, breathing soldiers, crying out in pain and terror, and the particular desperate urgency of people who are being killed and cannot stop it from happening. I ran toward the command center at full sprint, my bare feet gripping the metal floor with claws extended for traction. The corridor lights were flickering, switching between standard illumination and emergency red amber in a sickening rhythm that made the walls seem to pulse. I passed 2 Polani technicians running in the opposite direction, their faces gray with shock, and I shouted at them to arm themselves and report to the rally point, but I do not think they heard me. In the corridor outside the eastern junction, I passed Cade Harlow. He was moving in the opposite direction, toward the eastern wing, toward the sound of screaming and the deep, grinding vibration of the Veshkari breach. He was already in full armor, already armed. His rifle was up, his visor was down, and he moved with a fluid, ground-eating stride that covered distance with an efficiency that seemed wrong for a man of his build, as though every joint and muscle had been pre-programmed for exactly this motion, and nothing was being wasted on anything that was not forward movement. I caught a glimpse of his face through the transparent portion of his visor as he passed me, and what I saw there stopped the words in my throat before they could form. Nothing. There was nothing on his face. No fear, no anger, no adrenaline flush, no battle fury of the kind that Thelvari feel before combat, the hot surge of predatory aggression that my people call the blood rise. His expression was level and empty, and focused on a point ahead of him that I could not see, and his eyes held a stillness that I had never encountered in a living creature about to enter a combat zone. He had known this was coming. He had prepared for exactly this moment, and he was not running from the breach. He was running toward it. I reached the command center and found chaos dressed in flickering emergency light. Half the eastern wall of the outpost had collapsed inward, not from an external impact but from below. The Veshkari had tunneled directly beneath the outpost's foundation, bypassing every perimeter sensor and defensive position I had established, and had erupted through the floor of the eastern wing in a surge of chitin and acid and biological fury that had overwhelmed the defending soldiers before they could form a coherent line. The command center's tactical display was a storm of red contact markers, so dense in the eastern quadrant that they merged into a solid crimson mass that pulsed with each new sensor update. The duty officer, a Palani named Varric, was shouting into a communications console that returned nothing but static and the faint, distorted echo of his own voice. "They cut the relay lines from underneath," he told me when I reached his station. His hands were shaking badly enough to make the console inputs unreliable. "We have no external communications. No distress beacon capability. The garrison is fragmented into at least 4 isolated groups across the outpost, and I cannot establish contact with any of them. Internal communications are intermittent at best." "How many are we dealing with?" I demanded. Varric's face was the gray-white color that Palani skin turns when blood pressure drops from shock, and his pupils were dilated to full circles. The seismic sensors registered movement consistent with between 8 and 12,000 individual organisms before they went offline. The upper estimate could be significantly higher. There may be secondary formations deeper in the tunnel network that we never detected. 8 to 12,000, possibly more. The outpost garrison was 340 personnel in total, and fewer than 200 of those had combat training. The rest were engineers, medical staff, communications specialists, scientists, and support personnel whose most dangerous equipment was a diagnostic scanner. I began issuing orders with a calm that I did not feel. Rally points at the central hub and the armory junction. Fallback positions along the corridor intersections that could be defended by small teams. Emergency ammunition distribution from the central armory, which was still intact. Seal all non-essential access points. Get the wounded into the medical bay and lock it down, and someone find me a way to send a distress signal, because without fleet support, this outpost had hours to live, not days. Even as I spoke, I could hear the sounds from the eastern corridors growing closer. The wet clicking of Veshkari mandibles, thousands of them, creating a rhythmic chittering that vibrated in the walls like a living pulse. The hiss of acid sacs pressurizing, a sound like steam escaping from fractured pipes. The rapid hammering of armored legs on metal flooring, dozens of limbs per organism, hundreds of organisms, creating a rolling thunder of biological movement that made the floor vibrate beneath my feet. They were moving through the outpost like water through a cracked hull, filling every space, every corridor, every room, consuming everything in their path with the mindless, relentless efficiency of a natural disaster. Sorath appeared at my side with a squad of 8 Thelvari soldiers, armed and armored, their scales raised along their spines in full threat display. Among my people, the raised spine display indicates readiness for lethal combat. It is instinctive, involuntary, triggered by the proximity of mortal threat. But I recognized, with a sick twist in my stomach, that it also indicates something else that we do not speak about in our war colleges. Terror. "The eastern residential block is gone," Sorath reported. His voice was steady, which told me he was working hard to keep it that way. 17 personnel confirmed dead. 30 or more unaccounted for. The central armory is holding with a defensive team, but the southern access corridor is compromised, and the drones are beginning to probe the secondary junctions. The civilian shelter in the western wing is sealed and holding, but there are 46 non-combatant personnel inside, with no armed defenders between them and the swarm. 46 lives behind a sealed door. Scientists, engineers, medical researchers, administrative staff, people who had come to this outpost to do work that had nothing to do with fighting and dying. And the swarm was between us and them, flowing through the corridors like a tide of armored bodies and acid and hunger. "We push east," I said. "We retake the eastern corridor junction and establish a defensive line to protect the civilian shelter approach. That corridor is the direct path. If we hold it, we hold them." We moved out. My squad formed up around me in standard Thelvari assault formation, weapons hot, claws half extended for close combat readiness. We advanced through corridors that smelled of acid and blood, the acrid chemical stench of Veshkari metabolic fluids, mixing with the copper and salt smell of the dead. We passed bodies. Some were Thelvari, their scales torn and their armor dissolved by acid. Some were Palani, crumpled in the narrow spaces where they had tried to flee. One was a Dreth medic, who had died, still holding a wound kit in hands that no longer had fingers, the flesh eaten away by acid spray that had hit her while she was trying to treat a fallen soldier. My soldiers tightened their formation. I could hear their breathing change, the controlled rhythm of trained fighters shifting into the faster, shallower pattern of mammals, approaching the edge of what their nervous systems could process. The reality was settling over us like a physical weight. This was not a border skirmish. This was not a probe or a testing action. This was a full-scale swarm assault on an outpost that I had told everyone was safe. We rounded the corner into the main eastern access corridor, and every one of us stopped moving, as though we had hit an invisible wall. The corridor was 30 meters long and 4 meters wide, a straight channel of reinforced metal and composite that connected the eastern wing to the central hub. The walls were scored with acid burns that had eaten through the surface coating and into the structural material beneath. The ceiling panels had been torn away in places, exposing conduit and wiring that sparked and flickered like dying nerves. The emergency lighting cast everything in a strobing red and amber wash that turned the scene into something that looked like a hallucination. The floor was covered in dead Veshkari. Not scattered, not a few. The corridor was carpeted with them, dozens upon dozens upon dozens, their armored bodies broken and split open, their segmented legs curled inward in the death reflex that their species exhibits when the central nerve cluster is destroyed. Acid from ruptured sacs had pooled in the low points of the floor, eating into the metal plating with a quiet, persistent hissing sound that was somehow worse than the screaming had been. The air was thick with the chemical stench of Veshkari hemolymph, a sharp ammonia and copper smell that burned the inside of my nostrils and made my eyes water. And at the far end of the corridor, standing in the flickering light, like something pulled from the legends I had been so eager to dismiss, was Cade Harlow. He was drenched in alien blood. It covered his armor in streaks and spatters, dark green and viscous, mixing with the smoking residue of acid burns that had eaten through his outer plating in at least 4 visible locations. His visor was cracked from a direct impact. His left shoulder guard was gone entirely, either ripped away by a claw strike or dissolved by acid exposure. He stood with his rifle up and his feet planted wide in a stance that distributed his weight for maximum stability. And even at 30 meters, through the flickering light and the chemical haze, I could see the controlled rhythm of his breathing, the deliberate economy of his stance, the absolute absence of wasted motion. A ceiling vent burst open 15 meters ahead of him, and a Veshkari drone dropped into the corridor with a shriek that echoed off the metal walls. It was a full-grown combat drone, nearly 2 meters of armored cannon and blade-edged limbs, its mandibles spread wide, its acid sac pulsing with the pre-attack pressurization that meant it was about to spray. Harlow sidestepped the initial lunge without taking his eyes off his primary firing lane, drew a combat blade from his hip sheath with his left hand, drove it through the junction between the drone's head segment and thorax with a precision that found the exact gap in the carapace armor, twisted the blade 45 degrees to sever the nerve bundle, and ripped it free in a single fluid motion that lasted less than 2 seconds. The drone collapsed sideways, legs still twitching in autonomous reflex, and Harlow was already firing at 2 more that had emerged from a breach in the wall to his right. Both shots hit the cranial nerve cluster. Both drones dropped before they had fully entered the corridor. I had fought in wars. I had killed enemies in close combat with my own claws, felt the heat of their bodies and the resistance of their flesh. I had held defensive positions under fire and performed well enough to earn a commander's rank in a species that granted ranks only to those who had proven themselves worthy in blood and pain. I had never in my life seen anything like what I was watching. It was not the speed, although he was fast, faster than his build suggested, faster than the human physiology data in our databases said should be possible under sustained combat conditions. It was not the accuracy, although every shot he placed and every blade strike he delivered hit exactly where it needed to hit to cause immediate, decisive termination. It was the seamlessness. There was no gap between perception and action, no pause between one movement and the next, no moment where his body caught up to his decisions, or his decisions lagged behind his perceptions. He flowed from ranged fire to blade work, to repositioning to ranged fire again, like a single continuous motion, like a river that never stopped running, like his body was executing a program that had been refined over 1,000 repetitions until every unnecessary movement had been identified and eliminated. A fresh wave hit. 8 drones poured through the wall breach simultaneously, their mandibles shrieking, acid sacs pressurizing, armored legs hammering the floor in the coordinated rush pattern that the swarm used to overwhelm defensive positions. Harlow dropped the first 3 with rifle fire so rapid that the shots blended into a single sustained sound. He transitioned to his sidearm when the range closed below effective rifle distance, put 2 rounds through the 4th drone's acid sac at point-blank range, and the resulting detonation sprayed acid across the 5th drone's visual cluster, blinding it. He met the remaining 3 in close quarters with his blade, moving between them with a precision that placed him always in the gap where their attacks could not converge, always one step ahead of the geometry of their assault. He took a claw strike across his right thigh that gouged through armor plating and drew blood, bright red human blood that looked wrong against the green-black ichor covering everything else, and he did not slow down, did not flinch, did not acknowledge the wound in any way that I could detect. He killed the attacker that had wounded him, pivoted on the damaged leg as though it were fully functional, and used the falling body as a shield against an acid spray from the next drone, closing the distance in 2 explosive steps, and driving his blade upward through the mandible joint into the brain case, with enough force to lift the drone's front section off the floor. The last drone tried to flee. Some survival calculation in its limited neural architecture had identified this corridor as a death zone and triggered a withdrawal response. Harlow shot it in the back of the cranial segment from 3 meters. Then the corridor was quiet. He stood there breathing for exactly 3 seconds. Just breathing. Controlled, rhythmic, deliberate inhalations through his nose and exhalations through his mouth. Then he checked his weapon's charge level, ejected, and replaced his sidearm's power cell, wiped acid residue from his visor crack with the back of his gauntlet, and resumed his defensive position at the corridor mouth. He had not looked at us once. He had not acknowledged our presence, had not called for support, had not done anything that suggested he expected or required assistance. He had simply continued doing what he was doing, which was holding a corridor against a force that outnumbered him by a ratio that should have made resistance a mathematical absurdity. "Commander," Sorath whispered beside me, and his voice was the voice of someone watching a fundamental law of the universe being rewritten in front of his eyes. "What is he?" I did not answer, because I did not have an answer that my training, my experience, or my understanding of combat biology could provide. A secondary tunnel breach opened in the corridor wall behind us, cutting my squad off from Harlow's position with an eruption of shattered metal and packed earth, and the sudden, overwhelming presence of Veshkari drones pouring through the gap like liquid through a crack. They were everywhere at once, shrieking and spitting and clawing, and suddenly we were fighting for our own survival, weapons firing, claws slashing, the tight discipline of Thelvari combat doctrine holding us together in a formation that the Academy instructors called the Iron Circle. I fought beside my soldiers and killed 3 drones with my sidearm and 2 more with my bare claws. feeling the satisfying crack of chitin under my grip, and the hot spray of hemolymph across my scales. We lost one soldier, a young female named Keth, who took an acid spray across her face before anyone could pull her back, and the sound she made before she died was something I knew I would hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. We cleared our section after 6 brutal minutes and found ourselves cut off from the main corridor by debris and dead. I was breathing hard, bleeding from 2 shallow claw wounds on my forearm, and my mind was running 2 processes simultaneously. One was tactical, calculating routes and options and threat assessments. The other was still standing in that corridor, watching a human fight, and trying to understand what it had seen. Sorath identified a maintenance shaft that bypassed the blocked corridor and connected to the eastern section near Harlow's position. It was narrow and dark and smelled of burned insulation, and we crawled through it single file with drones scratching at the walls around us, the sound of their claws on metal creating a skittering rhythm that made my skin crawl beneath my scales. When we emerged at the eastern end, I found Harlow in a brief lull between assault waves. He was leaning against the wall, reloading his rifle with hands that trembled slightly. It was the first sign of human limitation I had seen since the fighting began, that faint tremor in his fingers, and somehow it made everything more disturbing rather than less. Because it meant he was not a machine. He was not some biological weapon engineered for this purpose. He was a man, a living creature with flesh and blood and nerves that felt pain. And the tremor in his hands was proof that his body was reaching its limits. And he was still here, still fighting, still standing in a corridor full of the dead, because the people behind him were still alive. "Sergeant," I said, and my voice came out differently than I intended. The command tone, the authority, the crisp professional distance that I maintained with every subordinate was gone. Something else had replaced it, something that I did not want to examine too closely. "How are you still standing?" He looked at me with eyes that were calm and exhausted, and older than his face had any right to be. Blood from a scalp wound had dried along the left side of his jaw in a dark red streak that stood out against skin that had gone pale from exertion. His breathing was controlled but deep, the kind of deliberate respiratory rhythm that suggested he was managing significant pain through conscious effort and force of will. "We are not the strongest species," he said. His voice was quiet, conversational, almost gentle, as if we were sitting in the mess hall rather than standing in a corridor littered with alien corpses. "We are not the fastest, or the most durable, or the most dangerous in any measurable physical category. On our own world, we spent 100,000 years being hunted by things with bigger teeth and sharper claws and thicker hides. Predators that could outrun us, outfight us, outweigh us, 10 to 1. We survived because of one adaptation that none of those predators had." He ejected a spent power cell from his rifle and slotted a fresh one with a practiced motion that his shaking hands performed flawlessly, the muscle memory overriding the tremor. "The body tells you to stop," he said. "When you have been fighting long enough, when the injuries accumulate and the adrenaline fades and the pain gets loud, your body sends you a signal. It is not a request, it is a command. Every system you have, every nerve, every muscle, every chemical process in your brain tells you to lie down, to accept that it is over, to stop spending energy on a fight that the mathematics say you cannot win. Every animal on our world obeyed that signal. Every predator, every prey species, every competitor we ever faced. When the body said stop, they stopped. The fight was over when the biology said it was over." He charged his rifle and checked the sight alignment with a series of quick, precise adjustments. "We did not stop," he said. "That is the adaptation, not strength, not speed, not armor or claws or venom. The ability to hear your own body telling you that you are finished, and to tell it that you are not. The ability to override every survival instinct, every safety mechanism, every shutdown signal, and keep going past the point where any rational organism would accept defeat." The walls vibrated. Through the metal, through the floor, through the bones of my feet, I felt it. The deep, grinding rhythm of thousands of clawed legs moving through tunnels, converging on this position. The next wave was coming. "It is not a gift," Harlow said. and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like sorrow, like a man describing a condition he would not have chosen if the choice had been his. Most days I think it is a curse, the things it costs you, the damage you take when you push past those limits. But today, there are 46 people behind me who are alive because of it, and I can still stand. He pushed off the wall, settled his rifle against his shoulder, and walked back to the corridor mouth without another word. The next wave came through the breach like a living wall of chitin and fury, and he fired. I fought beside him. I made the decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next, without analysis, without weighing options, without filtering it through my pride, or my training, or my 31 years of Thelvari military doctrine. I raised my weapon, moved to his left flank, planted my feet in the Veshkari blood and the acid-scored metal, and told Sorath to anchor the right. My squad spread across the corridor mouth in a defensive arc, and for the first time in the history of my service, Thelvari and human fought shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy. It was in those next minutes that I began to understand, truly understand, why every other species deferred to Cade Harlow. He did not just fight, he orchestrated. Even as he fired, and moved, and killed, and bled, he was reading the swarm's patterns with a processing speed that bordered on the terrifying. He called out emergence points 2 to 3 seconds before drones appeared, giving my soldiers time to adjust their aim and brace for contact before the enemy was visible. He identified concentrations within the wave, clusters of drones that were coordinating their approach to mass their numbers at a single point, and he directed fire to break those clusters apart before they could achieve critical density. He repositioned my squad members mid-combat with terse, precise commands that turned our chaotic, desperate defense into a coordinated kill zone where every weapon had clear fields of fire and every soldier covered another soldier's blind spot. Sorath, Zuto. 2 coming through the left vent in 3 seconds. Aim low. They will come in fast and belly down. Commander, the wall panel at your 9 is buckling from internal pressure. Acid breach in 5 seconds. Step back 1 meter. Rear team, hold fire on the floor grate. They are committing 4 drones single file. Let the first 2 enter, and then concentrate everything on the cluster at the entry point to create a body blockade. He was right every time. Not approximately right. Not right in general terms. Exactly, specifically, precisely right, down to the timing and the angle and the number of enemies and the tactical behavior they would exhibit on entry. I have been trained by the best military instructors the Thelvari Dominion has ever produced. I have attended the War College's Advanced Tactical Cognition course. I have studied combat prediction theory with the analysts who wrote the textbooks. None of them could do what Harlow was doing. None of them came close. I realized he was processing information at a speed and volume that my command training had taught me was impossible under active combat stress. The cognitive load of simultaneously fighting his own engagement, tracking enemy movement through multiple entry points, predicting behavior based on pattern recognition, and directing a squad of alien soldiers whose combat doctrine he had never trained with should have degraded his performance across all categories. It enhanced it. The more variables he had to manage, the more precise he became, as if the chaos was a fuel source and his mind was an engine designed to run on it. I understood then, with a clarity that cut through my pride like a blade through unarmored flesh, why the Palani asked him where to reinforce the wall, why the Dreth deferred to his evacuation routing, why the Kathiri logistics coordinator addressed him with reverence despite his lower rank. It was not worship. It was not mythology. It was not the superstitious awe of lesser species in the presence of a legend. It was the simple, practical, hard-earned recognition that this human operated at a level of combat cognition that other species had not evolved to match, and when survival was at stake, when lives depended on the next 3 seconds of decision-making, you listened to the one who could see things that you could not see. We held the corridor together for 40 minutes. My squad fought with the discipline and controlled ferocity that the Thelvari are known for across the galaxy. We killed dozens of drones, our weapons creating overlapping fields of fire that shredded the waves as they came. We took wounds. Sorath caught a claw strike across his chest plate that cracked the armor and left a bruise the size of my fist. A soldier named Dren took an acid splash on his left arm that ate through his gauntlet and blistered the scales beneath. We lost one soldier, a veteran named Varric, to an acid spray that hit his chest armor before anyone could interpose a shield, and he died on his feet, still firing, which is the death that every Thelvari soldier is taught to hope for. But every time I thought the line would break, every time the wave intensity exceeded our defensive capacity, and I felt the terrible sliding sensation of a position about to collapse, Harlow adjusted something, shifted a position, redirected fire to a critical point, stepped into a gap with his own body, and absorbed the attack that would have broken through, and the line held. Again and again and again, it held. Because this human was not just fighting the enemy in front of him. He was fighting the mathematics of the engagement itself, finding the seams in the probability of our destruction, and stitching them shut with precision and will, and the particular, relentless adaptability that his species had apparently been perfecting since before mine had developed spaceflight. Then the swarm adapted, and everything changed again. The direct assaults on the corridor mouth slowed, then stopped. The shrieking and the hammering of clawed feet faded, replaced by a silence that pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical pressure. For a moment, the absence of sound was more frightening than the fighting had been. My soldiers caught their breath, checked their weapons, applied quick field treatments to their wounds. One of them drank water from a canteen with shaking hands. Harlow did not relax. He stood at the corridor mouth with his weapon up, and his head slightly tilted, listening with an intensity that made his whole body seem like a sensory instrument. "They have stopped coming through the main breach," he said. "We have broken their assault pattern," Sorath said, and there was fierce pride in his voice, the savage satisfaction of a young Thelvari who had held his ground against impossible odds. "The losses we have inflicted have exceeded their commitment threshold." "No," Harlow said. The word was quiet and flat and carried no pride and no relief. "They are going around us. The hive mind has identified this corridor as a defended hardpoint and is rerouting the swarm to bypass it. Listen." I listened. Through the walls, through the floor, through the structure of the outpost itself, I could hear it. A grinding, scraping sound, rhythmic and wet, like thousands of mandibles chewing through metal and stone. The Veshkari drones were digging, not attacking the corridor, digging new tunnels through the walls and foundations on either side of it, opening bypass routes to reach the civilian shelter from directions that we were not defending. My stomach dropped. The blood rise faded, and was replaced by something cold and heavy that settled in my chest like a stone. "The supply caches," I said, and the words tasted like ash, because I understood now, with perfect, humiliating clarity, what Harlow had been doing in the days before the attack. The ammunition and medical supplies he had pre-positioned at 3 points inside the outpost. The 3 points I had dismissed as the harmless busywork of a paranoid advisory sergeant. They were positioned at the exact locations where bypass tunnels were most likely to emerge, based on structural analysis and geological weakness mapping that he had conducted on his own time while I was ignoring his warnings. He had predicted this, all of it: the initial breach, the corridor choke point, the swarm adaptation, the bypass tunnels. He had wargamed the entire engagement in his head and prepared for every phase of it, and he had done it 6 days ago while I was sitting in my quarters reading intelligence assessments that told me the Veshkari were not capable of strategic behavior. "Take your squad to the cache positions," he said. "Cache 1 is at Junction 7 Alpha, near the water recycling room. Cache 2 is at the southern maintenance hub adjacent to the secondary power conduit. Cache 3 is at the ventilation control station on sublevel 2. Each cache contains ammunition compatible with standard coalition weapons, medical supplies for field treatment, and a data card with structural analysis of the surrounding areas, including predicted tunnel emergence points. Hold those 3 positions, and the bypass tunnels cannot reach the shelter." "That leaves you alone in this corridor," I said. "Yes." "You can barely stand, Sergeant. You are wounded in at least 3 places that I can see. Your armor is compromised. Your left arm is not moving correctly. You have been fighting continuously for over 3 hours." He looked at me with those calm, exhausted eyes, and I saw something in them that I have never been able to fully articulate to anyone who was not present in that corridor at that moment. It was not courage in the way that my people understand courage. The roaring, defiant bravery of a warrior charging into battle with scales raised and claws extended, and the blood rise burning through every cell. It was something quieter, and infinitely more terrible. It was a man who had already run the calculations, who understood, with mathematical precision, exactly what holding this corridor alone against a continued swarm assault would cost his body, his health, and possibly his life, and who had looked at those numbers and decided, calmly and without drama, that the cost was acceptable. "There are 46 people behind me," he said, "and I can still hold a trigger." I went. I took my squad and I went, because he was right, and we both knew it, and because standing in that corridor arguing with him about his own survival was a luxury that 46 unarmed civilians could not afford. We split into 3 teams at the junction, Sorath leading one, Dren leading another, and I took the third personally. As we separated and moved toward our assigned cache positions through corridors that shook with the vibration of tunnel digging, I heard the gunfire resume behind us. Single shots, precisely spaced, methodically timed. Harlow was conserving ammunition now, making every round count, trading rate of fire for accuracy, because he knew that his supplies were finite and the swarm was not. He was fighting alone, again, against an enemy that had thrown hundreds of drones at his position and was about to throw hundreds more, and he was doing it with the cold, calculated efficiency of a man who understood exactly how many rounds he had left and how many enemies each round needed to account for. I fought my way to Junction 7 Alpha, through a corridor that was already shaking from subsurface excavation. I found the supply cache exactly where Harlow had said it would be, tucked behind a wall panel with a simple mechanical lock that any species could open without tools. Inside were ammunition blocks for 3 different weapon types, medical kits with universal applicators, water purification tablets, and a small data card. I inserted the card into my tactical display and found a detailed structural analysis of the junction area, with 6 potential tunnel emergence points, marked in order of probability, sight lines calculated for each one, and recommended defensive positions annotated with firing arc diagrams. The annotations were dated 6 days before the attack. 6 days. He had known for 6 days that this was coming, and when I refused to listen, when I dismissed his intelligence and overruled his recommendations, and mocked his species at a diplomatic reception, he did not argue, did not go over my head to the coalition command, did not file a formal protest or demand that his assessment be entered into the record. He quietly, methodically, without complaint or bitterness, prepared to fight the battle alone if he had to. And now, he was doing exactly that. The first bypass tunnel opened in the ceiling above Junction 7 Alpha, less than 2 minutes after I reached my position. The metal buckled inward, then split, and Veshkari drones dropped through the gap into the corridor with the shrieking, swarming fury that made them one of the most feared species in the contested sectors. My team met them with disciplined fire and the cold, focused fury of soldiers who understood that failure at this point meant the deaths of everyone they had sworn to protect. We held. Sorath reported contact at Cache 2 through the intermittent internal communication system. He held. The third team engaged at the ventilation station and held, though they lost 1 soldier in the initial breach before they could establish their defensive position. Through all of it, through the firing and the screaming and the acid and the dying, the sounds from the eastern corridor did not stop. Gunfire, impact, the shriek of dying drones. A pause, then gunfire again. For over an hour, as my teams fought and bled and held their positions against the bypass assault, I listened to the rhythm of one human fighting alone against numbers that defied rational engagement, and each time the silence between shots stretched a few seconds longer than the previous interval, I felt something tighten in my chest that I did not allow myself to name. We sealed the bypass tunnels using demolition charges that Harlow had included in the supply caches. My team linked up with a surviving Thelvari unit from the central garrison, 12 soldiers under a sergeant named Halev, who had been fighting a running retreat through the maintenance level for over 2 hours, and together, we pushed back toward the eastern corridor. When we arrived, the corridor was silent. The floor was buried under Veshkari dead. They were piled against the walls, heaped in the center of the corridor, stacked in places where bodies had fallen on top of other bodies and created mounds of armored kitting that rose to waist height. Acid from hundreds of ruptured sacs had eaten through the floor plating in several places, creating shallow pits of smoking, corroded metal that exposed the structural supports beneath. The walls were scarred with claw marks and projectile impacts, and the chemical burns of acid spray, and in places, the reinforced composite had been gouged so deeply that the corridor's structural integrity was visibly compromised. It looked like a place where a small army had fought and died. At the far end of the corridor, sitting against the wall with his weapon across his knees, was Cade Harlow. He was conscious. His eyes were open and tracking our approach with the automatic, involuntary alertness of a body that had not yet received permission to stop being in combat. But everything else about him told a story of damage that I could barely process, even as I catalogued it with the clinical detachment of a trained officer. His chest armor was shattered. The outer plating had cracked open along the sternum line, with fragments missing entirely. And through the gaps I could see the torn underlayer and the bruised, lacerated skin beneath it. His left arm hung at an angle that made my own bones ache in sympathy, the forearm bones visibly displaced under swollen, discolored flesh, and I could see from the wear patterns on his blade grip that he had been fighting with that broken arm for a significant portion of the engagement, gripping and striking and absorbing impacts with bones that were no longer structurally intact. The blade itself was snapped halfway down, the remaining stub still locked in his grip, as if his hand had forgotten how to open. Acid burns had eaten through his armor in multiple places across his torso and legs, leaving raw, blistered skin exposed to the chemical-laden air. Blood, human blood, bright red and wrong-smelling, had soaked through his undersuit along his right side from a wound I could not see, saturating the fabric and pooling on the floor beside him. He looked up when I reached him. His face was gray with exhaustion and blood loss, and his eyes took a moment to focus on mine, as if the mechanisms of perception were running on emergency reserves. "The civilians," he said. His voice was a rasp, stripped raw by hours of exertion and the chemical burn of acid vapor in his lungs. "Are they safe?" "They are safe," I said. "All 46. Every one of them. The bypass tunnels are sealed." He nodded once, a single, small motion that cost him visible effort. Then he exhaled, long and slow and deep, and I watched the thing that had been holding him together, the will, the adaptation, the override, whatever force it was that had kept a broken, bleeding, failing human body fighting at combat intensity for 4 hours and 11 minutes, against an enemy that should have overwhelmed him in the first 15 minutes. I watched it release. His shoulders dropped. His hands began to shake, gently at first, then with a violence that rattled his broken weapon against his armored knees. His breathing shifted from controlled rhythm to ragged, uneven gasps, and his jaw clenched hard enough that I could see the muscles standing out along his throat like cables. The pain. Hours of accumulated damage, suppressed, overridden, pushed down beneath whatever neurological mechanism his species used to continue functioning past the point of rational physical endurance. It was flooding back in all at once, a tidal wave of signals that his brain had been blocking and could no longer hold back, and I could see the cost of his adaptation written across his body in tremors and sweat and the rigid, locked expression of a man who refused to cry out. I knelt beside him without making a conscious decision to do so. My hand reached out and gripped his uninjured shoulder, and I held it there with a steady pressure that I hoped communicated something that my voice could not manage at that moment. He did not react to the touch. I do not think he felt it through the overload of sensation that was consuming his nervous system. Soroth appeared beside me and stared at the corridor of dead, with an expression of raw, unfiltered awe that he made no attempt to conceal. "How many?" he whispered. I did not answer, because I had started counting, and the number was already higher than I wanted to believe. A sound from above rolled through the outpost, deep and resonant, vibrating in the walls and the floor and the dead. Orbital engines. The distinctive harmonic signature of a coalition frigate entering close orbit. I looked at Harlow, and through his pain, through the shaking, and the gray skin, and the barely controlled breathing, I saw the faintest flicker of something cross his face. Relief maybe, or just the satisfaction of a calculation confirmed. He had activated the automated emergency beacon before the attack began, the distress call I had refused to authorize. He had found the backup system, a hardwired emergency transmitter that operated independently of the main communications array, and he had triggered it without telling me. Because telling me would have meant a confrontation that would have wasted time he knew we did not have, and because he had understood, with the quiet clarity that I was beginning to recognize as the most dangerous thing about him, that sometimes the right thing to do is the thing that your commanding officer has explicitly forbidden. Orbital strikes began hammering the Veshkari tunnel network outside the outpost perimeter. The vibrations shook dust from the ruined ceiling and made the piled dead shift and settle with wet, heavy sounds. Reinforcement shuttles were inbound, 6 of them, carrying combat teams and medical personnel, and the heavy equipment needed to secure a breached installation. The swarm, caught between a defended outpost and precision orbital bombardment, began to fragment. The hive mind coordination that had driven the assault was breaking down under the pressure. Individual drones reverting to survival behavior, scattering, burrowing, fleeing. Medics arrived within 20 minutes. 2 human medics and a death trauma specialist came through the cleared corridors at a run, and when they reached Harlow, the lead medic, a woman named Claire, dropped to her knees beside him and started working with hands that were steady and fast and carried the practiced certainty of someone who had done this before. "You held again," she said to him as she cut away his shattered chest armor and exposed the wound along his right side, a deep claw laceration that had been bleeding slowly for hours. "Yeah," Harlow said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "This is going to hurt." "Yeah." She injected something into the side of his neck, and within seconds, the trembling began to ease. The rigid lock of his jaw relaxed, his eyes unfocused and drifted. And for the first time since I had met him, Cade Harlow looked like what he actually was, beneath the adaptation, and the will, and the impossible endurance. A man, fragile and damaged and mortal, not a legend. Not a myth, not a god of war or a supernatural warrior from the stories that young officers told each other at diplomatic receptions. Just a man who had decided that 46 strangers were worth more than his own survival, and who possessed a particular, terrible biological gift of being able to enforce that decision on a body that had been begging him to stop for 3.5 hours. They lifted him onto a stretcher, and as they carried him past me toward the extraction shuttle, I stood in the center of that corridor and looked at what surrounded me. Veshkari dead, piled and broken and scattered across 30 meters of scorched, acid-eaten metal. I had started counting earlier and stopped. Now I counted again, methodically, the way I had been trained to conduct battlefield assessment. I stopped counting at 312. There were still more that I had not reached in the secondary piles near the breach point. 312 confirmed kills around a single defensive position, held by one soldier, for 4 hours and 11 minutes. My hands were trembling. I looked down at them, at my claws, at the scarred scales that covered them, at the hands that had killed enemies and held weapons and signed reports, and pointed at a quiet human sergeant while declaring to a room full of officers that his species was nothing more than mid-tier predators with a talent for propaganda. I closed my fists and held them until the trembling stopped. Then I walked to the command center, sat down at the only functioning console, and began writing a report that would change everything I had ever believed about what the word warrior meant. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to visit him. The Coalition frigate, a vessel called the Resolute Dawn, had established orbit and deployed a full support contingent to the outpost. Engineers worked around the clock repairing the breached sections, reinforcing foundations, replacing the structural elements that the swarm's tunneling had compromised. Medical teams treated the wounded, 37 personnel with injuries ranging from acid burns to structural crush trauma, to the deep psychological damage that comes from fighting for your life in corridors that smell like ammonia and death. The dead were being prepared for transport, 23 Coalition soldiers who would not be returning to their homeworlds alive, their bodies sealed in stasis containers and marked with the insignia of their respective species. The civilian shelter had been opened. All 46 non-combatants emerged unharmed, most of them blinking in the emergency lighting, with expressions of confused relief, unaware of how close they had come to dying in a sealed room, while a swarm of predatory organisms tore through the outpost around them. Several of them asked what had happened. When they were told, when they learned that a single human soldier had held the corridor between them and the swarm for over 4 hours. Some of them cried. One of them, a Polani researcher who studied deep space particle physics and had never held a weapon in her life, asked to visit Harlow in the medical bay. She brought him a cup of the same bland ration drink he always ordered in the mess hall. I was told he thanked her and drank it. I spent those 3 days doing 2 things. The first was my duty: battle damage assessment, personnel status reports, defensive reconstruction planning, communications with Coalition Command regarding the engagement and the implications for the broader Veshkari border strategy. Administrative necessities that occupied my hands and the surface of my mind. The second thing I did was something private. Something that my people do not perform willingly and rarely discuss in public. I examined my own failures. Thelvari culture values certainty. We are taught from the egg that doubt is weakness, that conviction is strength, that a commander who questions her own judgment has already lost the confidence of those she leads. Second-guessing is not reflection in our tradition. It is corrosion. The commander decides, the soldiers follow, and the outcome validates or condemns the decision. But the decision itself must be made with absolute commitment, or not made at all. I had built my career on that foundation. 31 years of certainty. 12 deployments, guided by the unshakable confidence that my assessments were correct, because I had done the work to make them correct, and that anyone who disagreed simply had not done the same work. Now the foundation had a crack in it that went all the way down to bedrock, and the crack was 30 meters long and 4 meters wide, and filled with 347 dead Veshkari drones. The battle data was unambiguous. I reviewed it repeatedly, not because I doubted it, but because some part of me needed the repetition before it could accept what the numbers were telling me. Sensor logs, security recordings recovered from backup systems, ammunition expenditure records, and post-engagement medical forensics all told the same story. Sergeant Cade Harlow had single-handedly defended the Eastern Corridor for 4 hours and 11 minutes against continuous Veshkari assault. His confirmed kill count, verified by physical body assessment and cross-referenced with weapons discharge data, was 347 individual combat drones. He had sustained injuries during the first 40 minutes of the engagement that the Thelvari Combat Medical Database classified under the heading incompatible with continued motor function, injuries that our physicians considered immediately debilitating under any circumstances, and he had continued fighting at full combat effectiveness for another 3 hours and 31 minutes after sustaining them. I read those numbers 5 times. I cross-referenced them against every available data source. I searched for errors, for inflated counts, for sensor malfunctions or recording artifacts that might have skewed the results in any direction. There were none. The numbers were as clean and cold and unforgiving as the corridor where they had been earned. I visited him on the morning of the 4th day. The medical bay aboard the Resolute Dawn was clean and bright and smelled of antiseptic compounds that made my nostrils itch. Harlow was in a private recovery room at the end of the ward. A regeneration cast covered his left arm from shoulder to wrist, the medical technology slowly knitting his broken bones back together at a speed that human biology could not achieve on its own. Bandages wrapped his torso and right thigh, covering the acid burns and the claw lacerations that were still healing beneath them. An intravenous line delivered fluids and medication into his right forearm, and a monitoring unit beside the bed tracked vital signs with quiet, rhythmic precision. He was propped up in the bed reading a data pad. When I entered the room, he looked up with the same mild, unremarkable expression he had worn on the day I first met him, as though the intervening events had been a minor disruption to his routine, rather than the most intense, sustained combat engagement in the outpost's operational history. "Commander," he said. I sat down in the chair beside his bed without asking permission. For a long time, I did not speak. I am not a species that finds silence uncomfortable, and Harlow seemed equally content to wait without filling the space between us with unnecessary words. Through the observation window behind him, I could see the curve of Athkara 6's surface, the brown and green patchwork of a contested world that had nearly become a mass grave. "I owe you an apology," I said finally. The words cost me more than any wound I had ever taken in 31 years of combat. They tasted like acid on my tongue, not because they were untrue, but because they were so far overdue that the delay itself was a failure. Not only for the mockery at the reception, for the distress beacon I refused to authorize, for the sensor data I dismissed, for the tactical recommendations I overruled, for the fortification requests I denied. Every decision my pride made during the 2 weeks before the attack was wrong, Sergeant. Demonstrably, measurably, catastrophically wrong. And those decisions contributed to the conditions that killed 23 soldiers and nearly killed 300 more. Harlow set his datapad down on his lap. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a subtle recalibration that I was learning to recognize as the human equivalent of paying close attention. "Commander, you do not owe me anything," he said. "I owe 23 dead soldiers the truth that their commander's arrogance contributed to the conditions that killed them. The least I can give you is the same honesty I owe them." He was quiet for a moment, studying me with an expression that was not judgment, and not forgiveness, and not pity. It was something I did not have a Thelvari word for. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who has seen this moment before, with other faces and other species, and who understands it without needing it explained. "Every species that encounters us goes through the same process," he said. His voice was conversational, unhurried, carrying the same mild tone he used for everything, from supply requisitions to life-or-death tactical analysis. Disbelief first. The stories do not match the appearance, so the stories must be wrong. Then dismissal. The biology is unimpressive, so the capabilities must be exaggerated. Then mockery, sometimes. That part varies. And then the moment. The moment where you see it with your own eyes and the stories stop being stories and become something else entirely. "I was cruel about it," I said. "I mocked your species in front of officers from 6 worlds." "You were honest about it," he corrected gently. "Your assessment of human physiology was mostly accurate. We are soft-skinned. We are slow to heal compared to species with regenerative capability. We are mid-range on most biological performance metrics. Our senses are unremarkable. We have no natural weapons worth respecting in close combat against any species with claws or mandibles or venom. Everything you said at that reception was factually defensible. You were wrong about the conclusion, but the data you were working from would have led most rational analysts to the same place. You are being generous with me, Sergeant." "I am being practical," he said. "Bitterness does not improve tactical relationships, and we are going to be working together for a while yet. The swarm does not forgive, it does not forget, and it learns from every engagement. What they tried here, they will try again somewhere else, with better tunneling and faster adaptation. I would rather have a commander who has seen what we can do and understands when to listen than a commander who still thinks the stories are propaganda." I studied him, this quiet, ordinary-looking man with the broken arm and the bandaged body and the calm eyes that had watched 347 enemies die at his hands less than a week ago. He did not look like a legend. He did not carry himself like a figure from an epic poem. He looked like a tired soldier recovering from serious injuries in a medical bed, reading status reports and drinking water from a plastic cup. And somehow that made the truth of what he was more impressive than any myth could have managed. "How do you do it?" I asked. "Not the fighting. I understand combat as well as anyone alive in my species. How do you continue? The injuries you sustained in the first 40 minutes should have ended your ability to function. Your own medical database says so. But you fought for 3.5 more hours with broken bones, open wounds, and a blood volume that was steadily decreasing. How is that possible?" He considered the question carefully, the way he considered everything. "There is a concept in human psychology," he said. "We call it the governor. Your brain has a system that monitors your body's condition and generates stop signals when it determines that continued exertion will cause serious or permanent damage. When you reach approximately 60% of your actual physical limit, the governor activates. Pain increases, fatigue becomes overwhelming. Cognitive function narrows, motor control degrades. It is a safety system, designed to prevent you from pushing yourself into territory that could cause irreversible harm. Every species has some version of it. It is a fundamental survival mechanism." "We do," I confirmed. "Thelvari combat doctrine teaches us to operate at the edge of that threshold, to push close to the limit without crossing it." At the edge, he repeated. Humans learn to go past it. Not easily. Not safely. Not without consequences. But it can be done. Because the governor is not a physical barrier. It is a signal. A chemical signal generated by the brain, interpreted by the nervous system, and experienced as a set of symptoms that feel absolute but are not. The symptoms are real. The limit they represent is not. Beyond the governor's threshold, the body still has reserves. Another 30 or 40% of capacity that the safety system is designed to protect. The price for accessing those reserves is significant. Tissue damage, muscle fiber breakdown, neurological stress that can take weeks to recover from. Sometimes permanent impairment, but in the moment, for the hours or minutes or seconds that it matters, a human who has learned to override the governor can operate at output levels that the brain was specifically designed to prevent. Your own brain tries to stop you, and you ignore it. We overrule it, he said. There is a difference. It is not ignoring the signals. You feel every one of them. The pain is real. The exhaustion is real. The sensation of imminent collapse is real. And it is loud. And it fills every part of your awareness. The override is not numbness. It is the conscious, deliberate decision to acknowledge all of that input and continue anyway. To tell your own survival instinct that you have heard its assessment and you disagree with its conclusion. He paused, and something crossed his face that was too complex for me to read with certainty. Something between memory and regret. Our ancestors needed it, he said. On our homeworld, we were not the apex predators. We were not the largest or the strongest or the fastest things in our environment. When the predator was all of those things, and we were none of them, the only advantage that mattered was the willingness to keep fighting after the body said the fight was over. Evolution kept the ones who could do that. The ones who could not are not our ancestors. I sat with that for a while. The clinical simplicity of the explanation was somehow more disturbing than the mythology. The legends made humans sound supernatural, like beings touched by divine forces, or enhanced by technology beyond understanding. The truth was bleaker and more profound. They were not magical. They were not enhanced. They were an endurance predator that had evolved the ability to self-destruct in slow motion if the situation demanded it, burning through reserves that nature had set aside for survival because the alternative to burning through them was dying without trying. You should not have been able to do what you did in that corridor, I said. No, he agreed quietly. I should not have. The governor was active within the first 20 minutes. By the end of the first hour, it was screaming. Everything after that was borrowed time, paid for in damage that the medics are still cataloging. And if the frigate had not arrived, if the orbital strikes had not come. He met my eyes, and for just a moment, the calm surface cracked, and I saw something beneath it that I was not prepared for. Exhaustion so deep it seemed to have weight and texture and color. Pain that had been managed and reduced but not eliminated, still burning somewhere beneath the medication, and beneath both of those, quiet and steady and utterly without drama, the acceptance of a man who had understood the terms of the bargain he was making when he walked into that corridor, and who would have honored those terms regardless of the outcome. Then I would have fought until I could not fight anymore, he said, and then there would have been nothing left for the governor to protect. He said it the way a man describes a professional obligation. Without heroism, without self-pity, without the dramatic weight that a storyteller would have given it. He said it as a fact, plain and complete, and the plainness of it was more devastating than any legend I had ever heard or dismissed. I stood up, I extended my hand, palm up, claws fully retracted, the Thelvari gesture of deepest respect between warriors, a gesture I had offered fewer than a dozen times in 3 decades of military service. Harlow looked at it, recognized it from whatever cultural briefing humans received before joint deployments, and placed his uninjured hand on top of mine, with a grip that was firm, despite the tremor of a body still healing from damage it should never have been able to survive. I will make sure the truth is heard, I told him. Not the legend, the truth. Just make sure they are ready next time, he said. The swarm learns from every engagement. Next time will be worse. I left the medical bay and returned to my quarters, and began writing the report that would define the remainder of my career. I submitted it unredacted, every word of it, every failure. My dismissal of Harlow's intelligence assessment, my refusal to authorize the distress beacon, my mockery of human combat capabilities at the diplomatic reception, quoted verbatim from my own memory. I included all of it, because the Thelvari Dominion teaches its officers that a report filed with omissions is a weapon aimed at the people who will depend on it in the future, and I had already pointed enough weapons in the wrong direction to last a lifetime. Attached to the report was a formal recommendation that the Thelvari Dominion Military Council reclassify humans from Tier 3 moderate threat to Tier 1 apex combatant with singular engagement capability. The recommendation was accompanied by the complete battle data package, including sensor logs, security recordings, ammunition expenditure analysis, medical forensics, and the structural assessment showing the number and distribution of enemy dead within Harlow's defensive position. I let the evidence speak in the language that military analysts understand best, which is numbers that cannot be argued with. The military council summoned me within a week of receiving the report. I stood in the oval chamber of the Dominion War College before 11 senior commanders, each of them decorated veterans with combat records that stretched back decades. They sat in the tiered seats that surrounded the presentation floor, their scales polished and their insignia gleaming, and they regarded me with expressions that I recognized because I had worn them myself not long ago. Skepticism, professional doubt, the particular resistance of experienced warriors being told that everything they know about a subject is wrong. They had read my report, several of them had clearly read it more than once. The questions they asked told me which parts they were struggling with. Commander Soreth, the council chair said, a scarred old warrior named Commandant Thravos whose combat record included engagements that were taught as case studies at the War College. You are recommending that we reclassify a species with no natural armor, no biological weapons, and a median strength rating below the galactic average as a Tier 1 apex combatant. This classification currently applies to 3 species in our strategic database, all of which possess physical capabilities that dramatically exceed human parameters. The Veshkari themselves are only classified Tier 2. That is correct, Commandant. On the basis of a single engagement involving a single human combatant. On the basis of what that single engagement revealed about the species as a whole, yes. Explain. I told them. Not the legend, not the myth, not the version that Academy cadets whisper to each other in the barracks after lights out. I told them what I saw, the corridor, the emergency lighting, the acid smoke and the chemical stench, and the flickering red-amber wash that turned everything into a scene from a nightmare. The quiet man with the broken arm and the failing armor, who walked back into the fight, over and over again, because there were people behind him who could not fight for themselves. I told them about the governor, the override, the adaptation that let humans push past the biological safety threshold that every other known species in the galaxy obeyed without exception. I told them that I had watched a single human absorb injuries that our combat medical database classified as incompatible with continued motor function, and then fight at full combat effectiveness for 3.5 more hours. Not through chemical enhancement, not through technological augmentation, not through pain suppression equipment, but through an evolved neurological capacity to acknowledge that his body was failing and to decide, consciously and deliberately, that his body's assessment of the situation was overruled. I told them about the supply caches, the 6-day-old annotations, the tunnel emergence predictions that proved accurate to within meters, the combat cognition that allowed him to simultaneously fight, track, predict, and direct an alien squad, under conditions that should have degraded every aspect of his performance, and instead enhanced them. And I told them about myself, about my arrogance, about my certainty, about the diplomatic reception where I stood in front of officers from 6 species and declared that human combat legends were propaganda, generated by storytellers who happened to carry weapons. I told them that every word I had said that night was based on data that was technically accurate and completely, devastatingly irrelevant, because the data measured the wrong things. The chamber was silent when I finished. 11 pairs of amber eyes regarded me from the tiered seats, and not one of them held the skepticism that had been there when I began. The legends are not exaggerated, I said into that silence. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. The legends do not go far enough. They cannot, because the reality exceeds what any reasonable listener would be willing to believe without seeing it themselves. Commandant Thravos leaned forward, his scarred face unreadable. You are asking us to change our fundamental strategic assessment of an entire species. I am asking you to look at the numbers, I said. "347 confirmed kills. 1 soldier. 4 hours. Injuries classified as immediately debilitating, sustained within the first 40 minutes. The numbers do not require my recommendation. They speak for themselves. What I am telling you, as a combat officer with 31 years of service and 12 deployments, is that we have been measuring the wrong things. We measure strength, speed, sensory acuity, natural weaponry. By those metrics, humans are unremarkable, but those metrics do not capture what makes them dangerous." I paused. The silence in the chamber was absolute. The most dangerous thing in the galaxy is not the strongest creature, or the fastest creature, or the creature with the sharpest claws. It is the creature that has already decided it is willing to die and keeps fighting anyway. That is what humans are. They are the species that does not stop. They do not have a threshold. They do not reach a point where the cost becomes too high and survival instinct takes over and tells them the fight is finished. They break through that point and they keep going, and everything on the other side of it is territory that no other species in known space can follow them into. The vote was held that afternoon. The reclassification passed unanimously. 11 votes, not a single abstention. 7 months later, I was at another diplomatic function. Different station, different sector, different war. The coalition had expanded its operational mandate along the Veshkari border following the Athkara 6 engagement, and new personnel rotated through the forward positions every quarter. New officers, new assignments, new faces at the beverage tables, telling stories and debating capabilities, and forming opinions about species they had never fought beside. I was standing near the observation window with a glass of something mild, watching the stars and thinking about a corridor, when I heard a voice behind me. Young, confident, carrying the particular, unmistakable confidence of someone who has studied war in classrooms and simulation chambers, but has never met it in a corridor full of the dead. "I am sorry, but you cannot be serious about these human stories," the voice said. It belonged to a Dreth officer, a lieutenant, with clean, unblemished armor and bright eyes, and the earnest conviction of someone who has never been forced to watch his certainties shatter and fall. He was talking to a colleague, a Polani communications officer, gesturing dismissively with one hand, in a motion that I recognized because I had made it myself less than a year ago. One soldier holding a defensive position against hundreds. The biology does not support it. Humans are adaptable, I will grant that. But they are a mid-tier species at best. The stories are cultural inflation. Every species does it to some degree. They take their victories and multiply them by whatever factor makes the tale entertaining enough to repeat. I set my glass down on the nearest surface and walked over. The Dreth lieutenant noticed my rank insignia and straightened into a formal posture, but I waved off the protocol and pulled a chair from an adjacent table. I sat down across from him, close enough that he could see the expression on my face and the age in my eyes, and the particular weight that sits behind the gaze of someone who has learned something the hard way. His colleague, the Polani officer, watched me with an expression that suggested she had heard this conversation before and knew how it ended. Perhaps she had served with humans. Perhaps she had her own corridor. "I used to believe exactly what you just said," I told the lieutenant. My voice was calm. I was not angry. I was not offended. I was something else. Something that did not have a clean name in any language I spoke. I said the same words, almost exactly, at a reception, very much like this one. I said them with complete conviction and the full weight of 31 years of military experience behind them. I said them in front of officers from 6 species, and I meant every syllable. "What changed your mind, Commander?" the lieutenant asked. He was respectful but unworried. He had the comfort of someone whose worldview had never been tested. I paused. Not for dramatic effect, not to construct a compelling narrative, because the memory was vivid enough, even after 7 months, to make my scales rise along my spine and my claws extend fractionally before I caught myself and retracted them. "A corridor," I said. "Emergency lighting. Acid smoke so thick you could taste it on your tongue. And a man with broken bones and failing armor who walked back into the fight because 46 strangers were behind him, and he could still stand." The lieutenant was quiet. His colleague was watching me with eyes that glistened slightly. "He was not superhuman," I said. "That is the part I need you to understand, Lieutenant. Because it is the part that I did not understand until I saw it for myself. He was not a god. He was not enhanced or augmented or chemically modified. He bled. He broke. He shook with pain when it was over, shook so badly that he could not hold his own weapon steady. He was mortal and fragile, and made of the same soft tissue and brittle bone that you and I could break with our bare hands. But he was also something else. He was a member of a species that evolved on a world that tried to kill them every single day for 100,000 years, and the ones who survived were the ones who could look at the part of their brain that told them to stop and say not yet." I leaned forward. I watched him absorb damage that our medical databases say should have ended his ability to function, and then I watched him fight for 3 more hours, not because he could not feel the pain. He felt every bit of it, because he decided that the pain mattered less than the people behind him, and his body, his fragile, soft, unremarkable human body, let him enforce that decision in a way that nothing else in the galaxy can match. "One man," the lieutenant said softly, and I could hear the disbelief struggling against something stronger, something that wanted to believe because the alternative was the comfortable ignorance that gets people killed. "One man," I confirmed. "And 347 dead enemies at his feet when it was over. I counted them personally. I filed the report. I submitted the evidence to the Dominion War Council, and they unanimously reclassified the entire human species on the basis of what one quiet, ordinary-looking sergeant did in a corridor that smelled like acid and blood, on a world that nobody outside the coalition command structure has ever heard of." The lieutenant swallowed. His dismissive confidence was gone, replaced by something more complicated and more honest. "The legends," he started, "are not legends," I finished for him. "They are field reports. Written by officers like me, officers who saw what humans actually are when the situation strips away the politeness and the quiet manners and the unassuming appearance, and exposes what is underneath. The reason those reports sound like legends is not because the authors exaggerated. It is because the truth is too extreme for any rational listener to accept without seeing it firsthand." I looked out the observation window at the star field beyond, the vast, cold, indifferent dark that stretched in every direction and held within it worlds beyond counting, and wars beyond numbering, and species beyond imagining. And somewhere out there, on some forward outpost or border station or contested colony, another quiet, ordinary-looking human was eating bland rations and reading data pads in silence, waiting for the moment when someone would need him to become something that the rest of the galaxy was not built to comprehend. "I went to Athkara 6 believing that humans were myth-makers," I said. "I left knowing that the myths are memories. They are not stories invented around campfires to make a mediocre species feel important. They are records of things that actually happened, written by people who were there, and the only reason they sound impossible is because what humans can do should be impossible. The biology says so. The mathematics says so. Every rational analysis of their physical capabilities says that they should not be able to do what they do." I stood up and retrieved my glass from the table. "The real stories are worse than the legends," I said, "because the legends at least have the mercy of sounding impossible. The truth does not have that mercy. The truth just stands in a corridor full of the dead and asks if the civilians are safe." The lieutenant did not speak again. The Palani officer beside him looked at me with an expression that said she had heard a version of this before. from someone else, at some other function, about some other human, and that the weight of it had not diminished with repetition. I returned to the window and stood there for a long time, holding my glass and watching the stars burn in their ancient, patient silence. Somewhere among them, the species that the galaxy kept underestimating went about its daily business, quiet and polite and ordinary, reading reports and eating simple meals, and sleeping in narrow bunks, carrying within its fragile, mortal, unremarkable bodies an adaptation that had conquered a death world and broken every model that every other civilization had built to understand what strength meant. Not because they were the strongest, not because they were the fastest, or the most durable, or the most heavily armed. Because they were the ones who did not stop.